Imagine this scene unfolding before your eyes. You're standing in aisle 4 of a supermarket in Buenos Aires, Argentina. You've got a carton of milk, a bag of pasta, and a bottle of oil in your shopping basket. You glance at the price tag on the milk, 500 pesos. You blink, momentarily confused by what you're seeing. A store clerk walks by, calmly peels off the price sticker, and slaps a new one on top, 600 pesos. Your heart starts pounding as you rush frantically to the checkout line, because you know, with absolute certainty, that if the line is too long, by the time you finally reach the cashier, your monthly salary might be worth 5% less than it was when you first walked through the store's front door. This isn't some dystopian science fiction novel. This isn't a Black Mirror episode designed to shock audiences. This was simply Tuesday in Argentina, during the height of its most recent financial psychosis. Welcome to the world's most chaotic, fascinating, and absolutely terrifying financial laboratory that exists on planet Earth. Argentina is a country that has defaulted on its sovereign debt 9 separate times throughout its turbulent history. This is a country that once had 5 different presidents serving in just 2 weeks. Argentina went from being one of the richest nations on Earth, richer than France, richer than Germany, richer than most of Europe, to becoming a cautionary tale that is taught in every economics classroom, from Harvard Business School to the University of Tokyo. If you truly want to understand how the global economy really works, or more accurately, how it spectacularly breaks down under pressure, you don't study Wall Street trading floors or Silicon Valley startups. You look directly at Argentina and its century-long economic experiment gone wrong. Here at Economic Rewind, we've analyzed the patterns that destroy national economies. And today we're going to dissect the addiction to debt, the dangerous illusion of sustainable wealth, and the wildest economic roller coaster ride in all of human history. Buckle up tight, because this ride is extraordinarily bumpy and the safety restraints have been broken for decades. Let us rewind the clock all the way back to when the phrase rich as an Argentine was it was actual economic reality. The year is 1913. You're walking down the elegant streets of Paris, and you overhear a waiter whispering admiringly about a customer who just tipped with a solid gold coin. He says with genuine respect, he must be rich as an Argentine. That was a real phrase used throughout Europe in the early 20th century, and it wasn't meant sarcastically. At the start of the 20th century, Argentina was on just doing reasonably okay economically. It was an absolute economic titan that commanded global respect. Argentina had the 10th highest gross domestic product per capita in the entire world. It was significantly ahead of Canada, Australia, and Italy in terms of per-person wealth. It was practically neck and neck with the United States in economic development and living standards. How was this remarkable prosperity possible? The answer was surprisingly simple: cows and wheat. The British Empire was hungry for food, and the Argentine Pampas, that vast, incredibly fertile flat land stretching across the country, was essentially the world's buffet table. The revolutionary invention of refrigerated shipping technology, known as the frigorifico system, meant that high-quality Argentine beef could travel across the Atlantic Ocean without spoiling and turning into a dangerous science experiment. Money flooded into Argentina from European investors and consumers. European immigrants poured into Buenos Aires by the thousands, calling it the Paris of South America because of its sophistication and wealth. And if you visit Buenos Aires today, you can still see the remnants of that golden age everywhere you look. The massive French-influenced architecture, the wide boulevards designed for carriages, the opera houses and grand hotels. It looks like a city that was built for an empire that never quite arrived at its full potential. So here's the critical question that defines Argentina's entire trajectory. What happened? How do you go from being in the global top 10 for wealth and prosperity to becoming an economic cautionary tale studied by economists worldwide? The fundamental problem was that Argentina's incredible wealth was unbuilt on a diversified industrial engine like the United States or Germany. Instead, it was built almost entirely on commodities, agricultural products that could be shipped overseas. When the Great Depression devastated the global economy in nobody was buying beef or wheat. The cash faucet that had made Argentina wealthy simply turned off. But instead of adapting to this new economic reality, instead of diversifying their economy or developing manufacturing capabilities, the Argentine elite and military engaged in a destructive game of musical chairs with the government itself. Between 1930 and 1983, there were 6 separate military coups that overthrew civilian governments. 6 complete changes of power through force. Imagine living in a country where you check the weather forecasts in the morning. You check whether the army is still in their barracks or marching toward the presidential palace. This era of constant political instability planted the seeds of Argentina's most fatal flaw: short-term thinking. No one plans 20 years ahead when you don't know who will be president next Tuesday, or whether there will even be a functioning government next month. The Golden Age had been a dangerous mirage because it created a standard of living that the country felt entitled to maintain even after the money ran out completely. And when the money runs out, but your population still wants to live like Parisian aristocrats, with guaranteed jobs and generous benefits, you do the only thing that seems politically feasible in the short term: you start printing money. Fast forward to 1945, and enter the main character of Argentine economic history, Juan Domingo Perón. Whether you love him or hate him, and in Argentina, there is absolutely no middle ground on this topic. You either have his face tattooed on your chest, or you literally spit when you hear his name. You simply cannot ignore his massive impact on the country's trajectory. Perón realized something crucial that previous leaders had missed. The working class had been completely left out of that Golden Age prosperity party. While the wealthy landowners got richer, exporting beef and wheat, ordinary workers saw very little benefit. Perón launched a massive political and economic shift that would define Argentina for the next 80 years. He nationalized major industries, including railways and utilities, dramatically strengthened labor unions, and substantially increased wages across the economy. For a while, it felt absolutely great. Workers had more money in their pockets, guaranteed vacation days, job security, and most importantly, dignity and respect in a society that had previously ignored them. But economics is a cruel, unforgiving science that doesn't care about good intentions or political popularity. You cannot simply decree wealth into existence through government policies to pay for all these expensive new programs. The Argentine state started spending dramatically more money than it earned through taxes and legitimate revenue. And this imbalance set up what economists call the pendulum, a destructive cycle that would swing back and forth for decades, for the next 40 years. Argentina swung violently between two extremes, like a country suffering from severe bipolar disorder. Swing left. Populist governments spend enormous amounts of money, they do you and have, to make people happy in the short term. Inflation rises as too much money chases too few goods. Then the economy crashes as the unsustainable spending creates massive debt. Swing right. Military dictatorships, or austere civilian governments, step in to fix the economy through harsh measures. They slashed government spending dramatically, cut social programs, and implement painful economic reforms. Poverty rises sharply. People get angry and desperate. Then they vote the populists back into power, and the cycle repeats endlessly. This destructive pendulum reached its absolute terrifying peak in 1989, during the presidency of Roloff. The economy didn't just break down. It completely evaporated before people's eyes. The inflation rate wasn't 10% annually. It wasn't 50%. In July 1989 alone, the monthly inflation rate was 197%. The yearly inflation exceeded 3,000%. Let me contextualize those numbers with a story that perfectly captures the surreal madness of that time. There's a famous anecdote about a man who walks into a bar and orders a beer. The bartender says, "That'll be 10 Australs," the currency they were using back then. The man drinks his beer slowly and asks for another one. The bartender says, "That'll be 15 Australs." The confused customer protests, "But I just paid 10 Australs for the exact same beer." The bartender simply shrugs and replies, "That was 10 minutes ago." People would receive their monthly paychecks and literally run to the nearest supermarket to buy anything they could get their hands on: canned food, toilet paper, cooking oil, batteries, because holding on to cash for even an hour meant losing substantial purchasing power. This hyperinflation completely destroyed the psychological concept of saving money for the future. In Argentina, even today, you don't save money in your local currency if you have any other choice. You save by buying property, investing in durable goods, or converting your pesos into the holy grail of stable value, US dollars. This hyperinflation trauma explains why your average Argentine taxi driver knows more about the US Federal Reserve's interest rate policy than the typical American investment banker. They hábito que no. Their economic survival depends on understanding global monetary policy. This 1989 chaos was the fire that burned the economic forest down completely. But from those ashes rose the wildest monetary experiment in modern economic history. The decade of pizza with champagne, and the dangerous illusion that 1 peso could actually be worth $1 forever. So how do you fix 3,000% annual inflation? You do something radical and desperate. You tie your country's hands behind its back and throw away the key. Enter the 1990s and President Carlos Menem, a flamboyant man with iconic sideburns and an expensive taste for the high life, along with his brilliant economy minister Domingo Cavallo. Together, they introduced the convertibility plan, which would become one of the most famous monetary experiments in economic history. The rule was deceptively simple. 1 peso equals $1 forever, guaranteed by law. If the central bank wanted to print a new peso, it absolutely had to have a US dollar sitting in the vault to back it up. No more printing press madness, no more monetary financing of government deficits. And guess what happened? It worked like magic. Almost overnight, inflation died completely. It was genuinely miraculous to witness. Suddenly, the Argentine middle class felt not just comfortable, but genuinely wealthy. Really, truly wealthy, for the first time in decades. Economists called this the era of pizza with champagne because ordinary people could suddenly afford luxuries that had been unimaginable just years before. Picture yourself as an Argentine citizen in 1980. You realize that a high-quality television in Miami costs $300. Since 1 peso equals $1, that same TV costs 300 pesos in local currency. So everyone started flying to Miami on shopping expeditions. The flights were completely packed with Argentine tourists. People came back with suitcases overflowing with microwaves, VCR players, designer clothes, and electronics. Argentines became famously known throughout Florida as the Dame Dos crowd, gimme two, because everything seemed so incredibly cheap compared to their previous experience that they bought two of everything just because they could. The International Monetary Fund looked at Argentina's transformation and declared it the best student in the class, a model for the entire developing world. IMF economists praised Argentina's fiscal discipline, monetary stability, and rapid economic growth. International investors poured billions of dollars into Argentine stocks and bonds. But there was a catch. There is always a catch in economics, especially when something seems too good to be true. While Argentine consumers were buying cheap imported goods, local Argentine factories were slowly dying. Why? Because if 1 peso artificially equals $1, Argentine labor becomes extremely expensive compared to neighboring countries. Brazil, Argentina's largest neighbor and trading partner, devalued their currency dramatically, making Brazilian products much cheaper than Argentine goods. Suddenly, Argentine manufacturers couldn't compete with imported products flooding in from Brazil, China, and other countries with cheaper currencies. Argentine factories started closing down. Workers lost their jobs. The country began running massive trade deficits as they imported far more than they exported. But the government maintained the peso-dollar parity no matter what, even as this policy slowly hollowed out the productive economy. By 2001, the system was clearly unsustainable. Argentina needed US dollars to maintain the currency peg, but they were rapidly running out of dollar reserves. The government tried desperate measures. They froze bank accounts, preventing people from withdrawing their own savings. They issued government bonds instead of cash. They implemented capital controls. The end came swiftly and brutally. In December 2001, massive riots broke out across the country. People banged pots and pans in the streets, demanding access to their own money. The president resigned. Argentina defaulted on its debt. Again, the peso-dollar parity collapsed overnight. Within weeks, $1 was worth 4 pesos. Then, 6 pesos. People who had dollar debts but peso incomes were financially destroyed. The middle class that had felt wealthy during the pizza and champagne years saw their savings evaporate. Unemployment skyrocketed. Poverty exploded. This crash taught Argentina another dangerous lesson that would haunt them for decades. When your economy depends on maintaining an artificial exchange rate, the eventual collapse is not just painful, it is catastrophically destructive to ordinary people who trusted the system. The 2001 collapse should have taught Argentina valuable lessons about the dangers of currency manipulation and fiscal irresponsibility. Instead, it launched the country into an even more bizarre phase of economic experimentation that would make the previous decades look almost normal by comparison. After years of economic chaos, Argentines were exhausted and desperate for change. In 2003, they elected Néstor Kirchner, followed by his wife Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, who would dominate Argentine politics for over a decade. The Kirchners represented a return to populist economic policies, but with a modern twist that involved manipulating economic data itself. The Kirchner administration discovered that if you don't like what the economic statistics are telling you, you can simply change how those statistics are calculated. Suddenly, the official inflation numbers stopped matching what people experienced in their daily lives. Supermarket prices increased by 25% annually, but government reports claimed inflation was only 9%. Year after year, the gap between reality and official data grew wider. 25% real inflation became 10% official inflation. 30% real inflation became 11% official. It became a national joke that Argentines called a play on words combining the National Statistics Institute with a Kirchner name. The government even tried to intimidate independent economists who published alternative inflation data that contradicted official numbers. McDonald's was famously pressured to keep the price of the Big Mac artificially low so that The Economist magazine's Big Mac Index would unveil how severe inflation really was in Argentina. McDonald's complied with government pressure, but quietly hid the Big Mac from their menu. You had to specifically ask for it. This era taught Argentines a dangerous lesson that would have lasting consequences. Truth is flexible. If economic data looks bad, change the data. If the country's debt becomes unsustainable, simply don't pay it. This philosophy led to increasingly surreal government policies and a bizarre international incident in 2012. A vulture fund, a hedge fund that specialized in buying defaulted debt for pennies on the dollar, literally seized an Argentine Navy ship, the Fragata Libertad, while it was docked in Ghana. Imagine the absurdity. Argentina's flagship naval training vessel held hostage in an African port by a hedge fund manager from New York because the bills were unpaid. By 2015, even the most committed supporters of populist economics had to admit the system wasn't working. The soybean commodity boom that had funded government spending was ending. The central bank's foreign currency reserves were nearly empty. The electrical grid was collapsing with regular blackouts because if electricity is provided for free, nobody invests in maintaining infrastructure. The political pendulum was ready to swing back toward the center. Argentines elected Mauricio Macri, a pro-business engineer, who promised to normalize the economy through gradual reforms. Macri's strategy was what the economists call gradualism. He didn't want to shock the patient with sudden policy changes, so he tried to fix structural problems slowly while maintaining social programs. But to pay the bills while implementing gradual reforms, Macri's government took out the largest loan in the history of the International Monetary Fund, $57 billion. This massive borrowing was supposed to provide breathing room for economic reforms to take effect. Spoiler alert, it didn't work as planned. International investors got spooked by Argentina's massive debt burden and ongoing economic imbalances. They pulled their money out of the country, and the peso crashed again despite the IMF support. By 2019, voters who were being crushed by renewed inflation and economic hardship swung the political pendulum back to Peronism. They elected Alberto Fernandez, who represented a return to the economic policies that had created these problems in the first place. And this is where Argentina's economic story becomes truly surreal. During the 2019 to 2023 period, the government decided that the best way to stop people from buying US dollars and draining the central bank's reserves was to simply ban ordinary citizens from purchasing dollars. They tightened what is called El Cepo, the clamp, allowing people to officially buy only $200 per month. That's it. But people desperately needed dollars to protect their savings from peso devaluation, so a massive black market exploded. This is where the famous blue dollar was born. If you walk down Cale, Florida and Buenos Aires today, you don't hear birds singing. Instead, you hear a constant chorus of men shouting, Cambio, Cambio exchange offering, to trade pesos $4 at black market rates. These dealers are called arbolitos, little trees, because they stand on street corners like urban forest. They lead customers to hidden cuevas, caves, which are illegal exchange houses concealed in the back of newsstands, flower shops, or jewelry stores. You walk in with stacks of pesos, they're counted by machine, and you walk out with crisp Benjamin Franklin $100 bills. It's completely illegal, but everyone does it. Police officers, government officials, business owners, ordinary citizens. The reason is simple. The official exchange rate was fake, while the blue market rate reflected economic reality. When the official rate was 350 pesos to $1, the blue market rate was often over 1,000 pesos to $1. This massive gap shattered the Argentine economy into what economists called a multiverse of exchange rates.